Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you on another episode of the Changing Minds podcast, season 2. I am very lucky today to be joined by a very important, very dear friend of mine, Neil Gordon. Neil is the creator of the Silver Bullet technique. He is someone who I only met last year, but we've since become close and had a lot of conversations, a lot of chats, and he's really given me a lot of suggestions, a lot of wisdom, a lot of advice in terms of positioning, in terms of business, in terms of online stuff. So he really has so much to offer. Neil works with people to help them to be able to find what he calls the silver bullet in their speeches, to find the core message that makes that speech, sing, that the core message that makes that speech impact the audience. And again, if you look at any great TED Talk, if you look at any great speech, if you look at any great book, one of the things they all have in common is that one golden nugget, that silver bullet that allows them to clearly and powerfully and persuasively communicate with people that are reading or watching or listening. And so today, I'm delighted to be joined by Neil because we're going to talk about the power of story. But first of all, welcome, Neil. Great to have you back, mate, and great to talk to you so soon after our last interview.
Yes, thank you for having me again, Owen. And I just want to say that I might actually borrow some of the things you just explained about the silver bullet in the future, because that was very well spoken.
No problem. You're very welcome to the man. And again, to me, one of the things we talked about the last time you were on the Changing Minds podcast was how you, I suppose, work on the silver bullet. Just to remind people, like, number one, briefly, what is the silver bullet? And again, I know I've given a little bit of an indication, but then more importantly, why is this so important, especially in the modern age, for people to have it in the speeches or the content they create or the brand that they communicate with the world that they have?
Yeah, and it's a very good thing for us to always remind ourselves of as well, especially as people like us get so evangelical about a technique or a thing and whatnot. And so why is it actually important? If we put ourselves in the shoes of a person who goes to a conference, I was just at a conference this past weekend. Actually, the last 2 weekends I was at conferences, and there was a variety of speakers at both events. And you have one person on stage for 45 minutes and then another person, and all of that. And at the one that I was at this past weekend, the guest speakers had something in common in that they had a lot of information that they provided. There were a lot of tips, there were a lot of actionable steps and whatnot. And what they didn't really have was a foundation or a grounding that tied all of the content that they put into their 45 minutes together into a really tidy place in one's mind. And I came out of it, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's interesting. Haven't implemented a single thing that they talked about. In fact, I don't even know where to start. And so the idea of the silver bullet is you take all of your expertise and you distill it down to a single power-packed sentence and structured a certain way. It's a certain kind of thing. And it winds up being important because when someone like me is at an event, when any of us is at an event like that, or consuming an article or reading a book or whatever it is, we might benefit a lot from all the different tips and more minute things. But we're more likely to implement it. We're more likely to integrate it into our mindset and how we go about solving a problem if we're more grounded in that central nervous system of that content. It's just this, that first guy who spoke, he was the guy who talked about blah, blah, blah. And that blah, 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 that single nugget of truth that the silver bullet represents helps us say, oh yeah, that's really cool. I really like that talk. I'm going to learn more about what he does. And that I'm going to learn more about what he does is such a critical part of any of the other content being actionable. So that's really the value that it grounds us in that motivation to move forward with something.
And why do you think it's so important nowadays more than ever? Like personally, again, this is something that I've seen. I mean, there's theories out there to do with the fact that communication has changed. So, some people say, certain countries are almost, run by tweeting and by tweets. And the social media space we have, whether it be Twitter, whether it be from a visual point of view, even TikTok now, which is shorter and shorter and shorter, before that Snapchat and Instagram and stories, we've such a short space in order to communicate our message. do you think also that that plays a part into why nowadays the silver bullet method is so powerful and so popular out there, since you brought it to the world?
Yeah, it really just comes down, Owen, to how the information age has just created consistent day and night overwhelm with content. We are deluged, and sometimes it's productive kind of content like what we're talking about. Sometimes it's just the TikTok is just some random thing someone puts on video, and it's gone, and whoever, I don't even remember how long TikTok disappears after, but it's just so fast, and there's so much that if everything is just noise, everything is just a bunch of tips or bit of action items and whatnot, it just never sinks in at all. And so the silver bullet metaphor is very deliberate in that it was the one thing that could kill the werewolf. You could throw anything you had at the werewolf and it would get up and run away and bite more people. But that silver bullet was the one thing that broke through all the noise and actually achieved the results that it wanted. And so now more than ever, as our attention spans become shorter and shorter, as the amount of content we produce and create and consume becomes more and more and more, it just becomes that much more important that if you only have 20 seconds or whatever it is to get across something to somebody, you really want it to land. So people have that aha moment and then say, oh, I want to learn more about that.
I love that. And I think I really love the metaphor as well of even the signal and the noise, the idea that we're bombarded with so much noise all the time. Everything we hear is noise except for whatever will make a difference to our life, whatever is clearly articulated, whatever grabs our attention, whatever gets our focus. And that often becomes the signal. And so in many ways, the silver bullet is the way that you turn noise into signal. So you take your content and you make it so that it communicates and people can really grasp it and stuff. Similar to, when you send out radio waves, you're tuning to the right frequency so they can hear those radio waves at that moment. To me, that's how I conceptualize or visualize what you do and the work that you do with the silver bullet.
Right. And you also bring something that inspires another thought, Owen, is that with the radio signal, with all of the ways that you attract people, because we're having to work harder and harder to get people's attention, sometimes our marketing efforts might be so disruptive that it could potentially create a little tension. People are like, this guy is promising the world to me kind of thing in his marketing, in his ad or whatever. And how do I know this is legit? And the silver bullet winds up providing the kind of substance, the steak to the sizzle, so that you can promise them the world and then actually use the silver bullet to deliver it to them. So there's real meat on the bones, even if you have to be, I don't encourage flashy, gimmicky kinds of marketing myself. I feel that it's important to be substantive in your marketing as much as possible, but we also need to draw people in on an emotional level. So it's a matter of following through on the emotionally heightened way that people have found us through our marketing. So there is a lot of value in this approach on many levels.
No, I completely agree. And I also think that, you've been so successful with regards to marketing this and so successful at putting this idea out into the world. So in a way, you're kind of, the proof is in the pudding. You're right. Using your own silver bullet to present the silver bullet to the world, which is magical. But let's get into storytelling, because I think that's one of the things that you do really, really well. Like, as you know, that one of my backgrounds is in everything to do with story, and you have a great background in terms of storytelling as well. So what do you think, first of all, what do you think you're doing right when it comes to storytelling? Or what are you trying to do right when it comes to storytelling? Or what have you changed to improve what you're doing right when it comes to telling stories?
Yeah, and I'm really happy to talk about this with you today, because we have probably heard from a lot of different sources how important and powerful stories are, especially in our marketing and in doing business. I help a lot of people on the stage with their speaking. And so there are plenty of speakers out there who use storytelling. And I've seen a number of speeches where somebody just kind of tells their story more generically, right? They just kind of do I grew up in this town and I did this and I did that, and here's a picture of me when I was in 4th grade. And it's heartfelt and well-intended for sure. And then they go on and they talk about I don't know, some random thing about marketing or something like that. And it never really connects in that way. And I would get into storytelling. It's funny. I remember, you want to know the very first time I thought about the value of nonfiction storytelling as a tool of persuasion? I didn't put it in those terms back then. Back like here in the States, we had a show in the 90s called Ally McBeal. And this was a story, it's a quirky lawyer show. And the main character, Allie, was a lawyer at this law firm and it's filled with all these quirky characters and whatnot. And one of the quirky characters was one of the partners in the firm, played by Peter McNichol. His nickname was The Biscuit. I think his character's name was John, and everyone called him The Biscuit. And a little guy, and was considered one of the best lawyers in Boston where the show took place. And I started to notice that his summation at the end of a trial was almost always a story. And he would tell this story about how something happened and he did this thing and all of that, and he would win all of his cases. And it's obviously, the show is fiction, but this is in the late 90s. I was maybe 20 years old, and I wouldn't have any idea that this was going to be my work way back then. I was a theater major back then. But I thought about how I just noticed the pattern. It was like, he's telling stories a lot. And for years, I would just be thinking about storytelling and where it showed up, and realized it was tremendously powerful. But what he did, and because he had this, whole room of well-paid TV writers to take care of his character for him, he always was on point. He was always doing this thing that was completely thematically relevant to the case that we had just seen over the course of the episode. And so the question became, if you have all these speakers out there who are telling generic stories and not really landing with their audience, and then you have the Biscuit who's telling all of these incredibly powerful stories at the end of these poignant episodes, what was the thing that was making these stories worth telling? Okay. And I have a couple of examples that I can make. With your indulgence, Owen, I'd love to tell a story about my life as a model, right? Mm-hmm. As a little learning experience here, right? And so when I was in fourth grade, my class did a production of The Jungle Book based on the Disney cartoon. And I played King Louie the orangutan. And so I'm this ape, and I've got this big brown t-shirt stuffed with newspapers and this wig and this mask, and I'm wearing these brown tights, and on my feet were these big furry gorilla slippers. And I'm slipping around and I'm doing all, and I was very animated. I was a big ham as a kid, and I was just jumping all over the place. But the very first time I wore my costume was for the first performance. So I'm doing my song and dance number. I'm kicking my legs every which way. And then in the middle of my number, the left slipper fell off my foot and landed in the pit between the stage and the audience. And in the split second that followed, I had the fourth grade equivalent of like an oh crap moment. And I just reared my right foot back, not even thinking, and I hurled the other slipper off my foot. It went halfway back across the auditorium. The entire audience went berserk. And it was such a great response that I deliberately kicked my slippers off for every performance thereafter, right? And I realized in that moment that sometimes the greatest catastrophes become the greatest opportunities for success. And so that winds up being a story that I consider worth telling. And there was a moment where you were listening, and because we're doing video now, your eyes went up and you had a little bit of a reaction, and like suddenly your mood changed for the slightest moment. And in case people are either just listening to this or they didn't happen to notice when watching, it was when the first slipper fell off. The slipper fell off and I had the oh crap moment, right? And what is it about that moment that is so significant that I'm putting focus on it? It's that it was a moment that I didn't expect to happen. I didn't expect my slippers to fall off, and then the first one did. And then I kicked the other one off. I suddenly adapted. I suddenly adapted. I showed up in the world differently because of an unexpected moment. And so the lesson in this is sometimes the greatest catastrophes are the greatest opportunities for success. And this circles back to a silver bullet because that statement winds up being the silver bullet like statement we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. And that silver bullet was born, the lesson of the story, and therefore the value of the story was born from the unexpected. Okay.
Love it. Love it.
Right.
It's interesting when you were talking about Ali McBeal and you were talking about the story, the closing argument. So one of the things that I loved, and I've actually just in the last week, I started watching episodes every night as a sort of a reward to myself for all the work I'm doing. But
Episode of that?
well, no, Boston Legal.
Oh, Boston Legal.
Boston
Sure.
Legal. So
I
do you
think
know?
that's a sister. That's like a sister show. I think it's all, but right?
It was connected. I think it came after the practice, but obviously there's a lot of influence from Ali McBeal onto
Oh
Boston
yeah,
Legal.
yeah.
But it's very funny as well. I mean, it's great. Some amazing characters, you know. There's like William Shatner plays a guy called like Danny Crane, and he's like a bit of Alzheimer's.
The practice existed in the same world.
Yes.
And then Boston Legal is later. Okay, got it.
That's it. But it's wonderful. But what's great about it is you have one of the characters there who's friends with Danny called Alan Shore, and his closing arguments. He's played by James Spader, who's a phenomenal actor.
Sure.
He has this thing where before a closing argument, he would like close his suit jacket, and then he would just present. And what they did so well, the writers did, and his performance was to boot, is he would tell the story, but he would make it feel like the stakes were so high, and there was no way that he could possibly win. So they really did a good job of making it impossible. So before he was doing his closing argument, you're going, there's no way that person's going to get off. There's no way that company's going to win. But his speech was so good, and it was only like a minute, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. But because, like you said, he brought people through the story, and because he was really performing it so well, and the writing was so good. It was, by the end of it, you're like, well, of course they got off. You know, it's so, from a change of minds perspective, and I love it now because even at nighttime, even though I'm watching it for fun to reward myself, I'm also reminding myself of something. I remember at one training I did years ago, I played a clip of one of the things, and we all sort of dissected it and looked at his speech in that moment and what was he doing. And so I really, when you were talking to Ali McBeal, I was like, oh, wow, you know. And when you talked about the slipper story and throwing that second one off and adapting, I love that as well, because so often we talk about storytelling, but we don't recognize that the character in a story is forced to adapt, similar to when you're listening to a story and you're deciding whether or not you're going to invest in something, you have to make the adaptation that allows you to be able to deal with the problems or the struggle. So it's not just about the hero faces the monster and learns from the guide. The guide in that case was your intuition of what you needed to do in order to make it okay that one of your slippers came off. So the slipper coming off is the monster. The intuition is the guide. But the decision that you made is you applying the wisdom from your own intuition and getting results in that moment. And I think a lot of people, when we talk about story, they gloss over that. So I love that idea.
Yeah. It's the sort of thing where we could get pretty nuanced and pretty granular about all of it. But what's fascinating to me is without that kind of subtlety and recognizing the significance of intuition, like you're talking about, and then the way we respond and we show up and express ourselves in response to that intuition, without all of those pieces, it's almost like a marketing funnel. If you don't have all the pieces of your funnel in place, if you're not doing all the things right, then you're not going to get the desirable outcome you want for the funnel. And it's a similar thing in constructing a story in and of itself.
And what do you think makes a story worth telling? You know, I mean, what is it that great stories do? Let's talk about the difference between a good story, because good stories have, heroes that have struggles, that have to adapt and that have to learn and that have to overcome those in order for them to live happy ever after. What makes a great story great as opposed to good, in your opinion?
Well, we have obviously the ingredients, which could in theory be there in both a good story and a great story. And so there's like my slipper story, I would say, qualifies as a good story because it's cute and the stakes are not super, super high and it's endearing and all of that. But what would make a story great, even if it has all the same ingredients that we're talking about with the unexpected moments and all of that? And I would say that we could look at the James Spader Boston Legal example as a way to break that down and dissect that. What you explained there was an unlikelihood of a certain outcome. That you basically described an episode that the stakes were really high and it was so unlikely that it was going to go James Spader and his client's way. It just seemed like we were dead set on a certain outcome. How is he going to pull this off? How is this going to happen? And so I would say it's a combination of an against all odds kind of outcome that the story has been set up to think that there's just no way this can happen. And then it does actually happen at the end, that the stakes are meaningful enough that people resonate with what happens. And I would even say that it really helps. I would say that it really helps if the insight that's gained from this against all odds outcome is something that is maybe not explicitly stated, but is somehow expressed through the story, the lesson, right? It's not just an against all odds kind of outcome. It's that the audience can believe that that outcome was actually possible, even despite the astronomically high odds against that outcome taking place. So I have to admit, I had to talk my way through that response just to figure out my answer, because if I'm to be totally transparent with you, Owen, I hadn't actually worked that out in that precise way that you asked me.
Well, I really like the answer, and I think it's spot on from my point of view, because how I see it is similar in that when you make a story great, there's a few things to me that makes a story great from good to great. One is, like you said, it's that unexpected thing that occurs. So it's not just that they adapt to whatever the conflict is. It's that you don't see it coming. You do not see the change occurring. Like if you take, for example, we were talking about it briefly earlier, but one of the films that's nominated for an Oscar at the moment is, I think, my favorite film in years, if not one of my favorite of all time. Is called Parasite. And
I just watched it.
Oh, I mean, we won't spoil it for people, but I don't know about you, man. That blew the. I watched it. I came back and saw it a second time, and I loved it just as much the second time. Well, maybe not just as much, but almost as much. So, Parasite is a Korean film, and it's just one of those that they call it genre shifting. So it changes genre in the middle of the thing, and the genre is like, is it a comedy or whatever? And it starts out as a dark comedy, and then it kind of pivots and changes. But what's great about it is it's unexpected. What's also great is, and this is for most of the films out there, even 1917 is out there in contention as well, I believe, The Irishman, is that the stakes are high. So a great story has, as you mentioned, high stakes. A great story is when things are unexpected. A great story is when the odds are against you, when there's a huge underdog in that story. And I think also that a great story has many moments inside of it which entertain. So if you look at, again, Parasite, it's really funny on a consistent basis. So you're entertained, you're drawn in. They have great characters who are entertaining, but yet with all the entertainment, there's lots of turning points where things are good, where things are bad, things are good, things are bad. So it's again, it keeps you at the edge of your seat. And Knives Out is like that as well. Knives Out, which is another film, not necessarily an Oscars contention, but it's well well liked, I think, at the
Sure.
moment. And that's a murder mystery thing. And once again, it keeps you guessing and keeps you surprised. But with all of that being said, I think the other dynamic piece relates to the last point that you made, which is, I think, like Robert McKee says, write the truth. And Bob says that's the most important of all the aspects of storytelling, is you tell the truth. You say something that people go, that's true. That feels true to me. That feels real. And so
Right.
you have high stakes, you have all these different things, but yet you do it in a way that feels authentic, that feels real, that people go, shit, that's real life. When I watched Parasite, it blew my mind. I went away going, wow, that was so good. And even though it was like crazy, I'm still thinking it's real. It's
Yeah.
true. It's not that it happened, but it felt honest to me.
Right.
You know, it wasn't like they weren't they weren't pretending something that wasn't there, you know, and I love
Right.
that sort of stuff. And to me, those are the core ingredients, if that makes sense. Is what I'm saying making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you landed on that last point too, because to me, in talking it through with you, it does very much dovetail with the larger conversation around silver bullets and whatnot, in that a great story is believable, in that, not even if it's fantasy, even if it's Harry Potter or Clash of the Titans or whatever it is, even if you have all these fantastic elements, if the underdog achieves the outcome through the unexpected twists and the high stakes and all that, and yet they still triumph, or they get whatever outcome they get, if the audience doesn't believe that journey, then it just doesn't have the possibility. It's much less of a likelihood. And I would even say, I mean, I try not to be absolute when it comes to communication and content, but it's just very unlikely that it'll be experienced as a great story in the audience's mind. It needs to be, and that's where the lesson, that's where the way that the characters show up, or in the nonfiction world, the way that we respond and adapt and whatnot actually is believable. And we could see that that happens. And there's a really nice example of what I feel is a really well told story in a TED type setting. And it's one of the most popular talks on the TED website now, with tens of millions of views. And I believe it was originally a TEDx that graduated up to the main TED website. And it's by a man named Sean Aker.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's called The Happy Secret to Better Work, if I'm not mistaken. And he opens, I don't know if you remember, Owen, but he opens the talk with a story. And I like to use it as
The bed bunks.
the bed bunks, and his younger sister, who he's like 7 and she's 5, and she falls out of the top bunk and lands on the floor, and she lands on her hands and knees. And he said, I think her name is Amy, and she's like, you know what this means, Amy? It means you're a unicorn. And so what was going to possibly be her wailing and screaming, and all of a sudden his life is worse because she's fallen out of the bunk bed on his watch, she accepts this and just goes on and plays. I might be butchering some of the story, but because it's been a little while. But I love that story as a great example of what we're aiming for here, because it has the unexpected moment where she falls out of the bed. He adapts by saying something, and he comes up with the unicorn line, which to his, 7-year-old brain, that's really to his tremendous credit, and that he thought of that. And I totally believe that 5-year-old girl was fine after that. I totally believe that suddenly realizing she's a unicorn is absolutely enough to get her out of being scared of having fallen out of the bed.
Yeah.
I fell out of my bunk bed when I was about 5 or 6. And that was not a good moment for me, because nobody was there to tell me that I was a unicorn. I believe that that was something that she responded to in that way. And that to me made it a great story.
Love it. And also, that in general, that speech is fantastic speech. To me, it's probably the funniest, if not up there. It's one of the funniest, along with Ken Robinson's one, in terms of the funniest TED Talk out there. So definitely check it out. I'll put it in the show notes as well, everyone. But it's Sean Aker's, about happiness, and he's also written a book as well on happiness. But I definitely recommend the TED Talk as well. So just in getting there, and just one more thing I wanted to explore on this with you, Neil, is to do with bringing this back to the business world. So so it's a lot of times when we think about stories, the great or best examples are either anecdotes we have from our personal life or incredible movies like we've talked about. But let's say, for example, you're doing an online campaign, or let's say you're doing a social media campaign.
Sure.
What are the steps that you can take to start to create sizzling stories that are able to, whatever, position you in the best way, sell your products, get leads into your lead magnet, whatever it is? What are the ways, what are the things that people out there that are coaches, that are trainers, that are speakers, that are thought leaders, that are looking to be able to work online, what are the most important things you think they need to know to use stories in their marketing, both online in terms of their email marketing as well as social media?
Sure. There are a lot of different directions we could go in, and because there's so many different expressions of content in the marketing space, and we can talk about several if you'd like, but
Sure.
One that stands out for me is the creation of webinars. And the way I'm not running a webinar per se right now, but I did for a little over a year, and it was very effective. It converted a lot of people to discovery calls, which is what the goal was, the desired outcome was. And the model taught the viewers of the webinar 5 shifts on how to become a truly captivating public speaker. And in, I would say, I think 4 of the 5 shifts, I featured a case study. Okay, I featured a case study around a client with whom I had worked who had achieved a desirable outcome. Now, what most people do when they incorporate a story into something like a webinar or other marketing content is they might just talk about the fact that so-and-so got an amazing outcome. And even testimonials, when they're written, people are just like, oh yeah, I got an amazing outcome. And that's nice. But we're talking about when converting somebody to want to buy our product or do a discovery call at the end, a call to action at the end, what we're ultimately wanting for them to do is believe that if they take the next step with us, that they're going to get the outcome that they seek. And so the mistake that most people make with their stories in a webinar type body of content is that they just talk about the outcome and they don't actually take the audience through a before and after. And so I had 5 shifts, and each of the 5 shifts had their own silver bullet. They each had their own lesson, right? And so what I did was I found stories that they didn't just get a good outcome, but they struggled with a certain pain point. And then by doing a couple of things, that led to the desirable outcome. And so they become a living example, not just of success, but of how that concept, that silver bullet-like concept, led to the success. And so to circle back to the ingredients around the unexpected, how do we use that unexpectedness in our marketing storytelling? And so when it comes to persuading people with stories, this isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule, but what I've found has often been the most effective way to incorporate storytelling into marketing content is that the unexpected element winds up being the solution that we are introducing into that client's life. So the client struggled with their pain, and then all of a sudden, unexpectedly, they got this great insight, which comes from you, right? And this great insight led to a whole different way of solving the problem to get them out of that pain. And then they got this amazing outcome. So we have all of these different ingredients that all ultimately come together so that you have a person in pain, an unexpected moment forces them to adapt. The adaptation is grounded in your lesson, your takeaway, and then they have this amazing outcome in response. And that presents believability for your audience, and it leads them to being able to see, oh, that could work for me as well.
Okay, no, I love that. What would you say just on that How would you say to translate this for, let's say, social media story? Have you any suggestions on, because that's going to be a lot tighter as well. And I suppose not like with a webinar, you've got something that's, out there online and that people are sitting there and watching it. With social media, right, you've got less attention. You got to, I suppose, grab their attention quicker and for a short amount of time. Have you any suggestions on what a person could do to improve their social media storytelling?
This is kind of a Wild West question for me, Owen, because I would say that if we're I relate, I'll be completely transparent. I mostly relate my social media content to paid traffic right now. I do posts, and I've done some Facebook lives or a Facebook live recently and whatnot, but it's not, and I do post content usually most days and whatnot, but I like to generate traffic through paid, like Facebook ads and things like that. And so my expertise falls more under the purview of how to make an effective ad in that particular case. And what I've found is that getting into storytelling in an ad winds up being less important than speaking to the problem that your target audience has and then causing them to click through, so then to watch something like a webinar or even an ungated video or something like that. So storytelling might or might not be the first thing that you put into a post. That being said, I've helped some clients to work out some very effective funnels that start with like a post on social media, like a Facebook post that then they then promote. They put some money behind, because in terms of, if you post something on social media on your business page, the current algorithms as of our conversation are not really supporting getting a lot of traffic and a lot of eyeballs on the post, because Facebook wants business owners to pay for their eyeballs. And so it's different than just posting something to your friends and all of that. And so if you put a post on Facebook, I've had some people help along their goals and get some traffic and get lead generation and all of that by just simply writing a story in a post and then having a call to action at the end. So that has ultimately worked, but it does still come with a need to pay for it. So I don't want to misrepresent the practices in any way, but doing an ad that speaks about the pain point and then leading into content that tells a story, that can work. Or just having a promoted post and a call to action at the end, that can work as well. But again, it would need to be promoted.
Super. Well, listen, Neil, I won't keep you any more of your time, but we definitely have to do this again, because I could talk to you for days. It's great.
Love the conversations.
That's it. So I'm already looking forward to the next time. But look, thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks for the great wisdom about the silver bullet, and especially about story this time. I'm sure the listeners got a massive amount of value and stuff. And if they need to hear more about you, it's neilcanhelp.com, NEIL canhelp.com. And anywhere else I should send people to?
Well, if I just launched a new speaker quiz, if you're interested in captivating your audiences instantaneously using your basic nature as a speaker, then figure out what that nature is at neilcanhelp.com/quiz. And they should find out some cool stuff about themselves and how they can truly captivate their audiences.
That sounds a lot of fun. I'm gonna take that quiz today myself.
Beautiful. Love it. Love it.
Thanks a lot, mate. Talk to you soon, buddy.
All right. Thanks, Owen.